So welcome to this video where I will do my best to explain encoders and encoder programming and why you should be using your encoders when working with your robots. They're essentially the lifeblood of enabling autonomous movement, or at least getting you to that level of precision with autonomous movement. No longer should you be needing to use timers and lose a whole bunch of accuracy when estimating how far your robot's going to move within the amount of time given to it. You can now move exactly how you want to move with encoders. So right off the bat, congratulations for making it this far. If you've gotten this far, you have essentially got to the point in my robotics career where I left. I never really had an opportunity to do autonomous, or I have, but it was always voltage and time based. It was never super duper precise with our motions. And I think that the most advanced I would have gotten with my robotics would be using take back half algorithms on my Vex robot for kind of controlling velocity of a flywheel. But that's just another application of encoders. And it really, I wish I kind of learned this a little earlier, or had enough time to work with my robot to actually implement it well earlier. But I mean, hey, grade 12, I did the best I could, given the tools provided. But anyways, the backstory, deep Aaron lore aside, let's actually learn something. I'll be working with blocks because that's what most of you work with, at least starting, that is. I'd like to kind of get a little of the Java code in eventually. For now, I'm working with the majority at this point. And by majority, I mean the ones that I'm currently teaching as of 2024. So what exactly are encoders? Well, simply put, they're sensors that we put on rotary mechanisms to count the amount of rotations that rotary mechanism undergoes. These rotary mechanisms are essentially our chassis, if we can put them on our wheels. There are telescopic lifts, if they're driven by pulleys. They are sprocket systems, or whatever we kind of need them to be. And these rotations are usually measured in ticks. They're not one-to-one with the actual wheel rotation or mechanisms rotations, unless they are the exact same size as the mechanism, but chances are they're not. They're usually smaller, and we'll put them on like a shaft. The encoders that we'll be working with today are optical shaft encoders mounted on the backside of our motors. So if I really cared for doing the math, I'd want to know the diameter of my wheels. I'd also want to know how many ticks per revolutions that my encoder will count whenever it makes one full revolution. I'd also want to know any gear ratios that are tied to my chassis in order to make that math easier for deciphering exactly how many rotations or the distance that I'd want to travel. And that's where the precision of working with encoders comes in. I am not going to do that for y'all. I would recommend that you look into it yourself in order to build some very unique and interesting systems. But I'm going to give you the kind of quick and dirty TLDR about why we'd want to use our encoders with our drive system, or any applications that we're really looking to use. And pretty much just, how do I solve the problem with respects to my arm keeps falling, or I want to move my arm to a certain position. Even then, this information can then be extrapolated, and we use that to work with your drivetrains so that you could get them moving with a quick and dirty way of getting your robot to move a little more precise than, again, with time. For now, we're just focusing on moving our arm. So if you see here, we have a very, very simple op mode. This is currently for a demo robot. I have left and right, which represents just a simple drivetrain, little chassis with two motors attached to the left side of the drive base and the right side of the drive base. So I'll kind of take this time to also go over some of the blocks that we're using. I'll just step through all this code so you could adjust your code accordingly. So first things first, initialization. I'm setting the right direction to reverse because I want my wheels to spin in the same direction. And one of these wheels have to be reversed. So I chose right. Here's the zero power behavior. This block, essentially how the motors will work when there is no power. So when you cut power to the motors, what will happen? So we have brake and we have float. Brake will mean the motors will just stop right there on the spot. Float will kind of stop it, but it'll kind of ramp it down so it kind of like coasts. And now we get to the actual fun part. We have our modes that we're setting our motors to. So here, I'm setting it to stop and reset encoder, and this is something that you want to be doing whenever you're working with your encoders. Just right off the start, make sure that you're stopping and resetting your encoders. There's quite a bit of there's quite a bit of modes to actually work with when you're working with your encoders. We have run without encoder, so that's usually how they normally operate. We have run using encoder, so this allows us to use our encoders. You kind of have to be a little more technical, or you have to be a little more hands-on with it. There's some, if you want to implement your own algorithms, you're probably using this one. We've run to position. This will be the very simple stuff that we're working with now. We have stop and reset encoder. There's also a document that you should look up real quick. So here is the blocks programming reference manual. It's a little out of date, but it still has quite a bit of definitions on the blocks that's available through the blocks programming language. So we could see here, if I go to DC motor, we can see the different variables, or I guess the different attributes that are attributed to a specific section. So in the DC motor section, we have these attributes: direction, mode, power, and zero behavior. And it also provides a little bit of a description as well. So here we have a description for the mode, or the set mode block right here, where it kind of talks about the different modes that I just went over. So we have run without encoder, we have run using encoder, run to position, and stop and reset motor description. So if you could get your hands on this document, which I'll probably link in the video, please use it whenever you have a question of what does this block do. I should also note that this top part right here are the default attribute setting, or the default settings for these attributes. If these aren't explicitly called through a block, so if they're not explicitly called up here with a set mode, then this is what they'll default to. As I stated earlier, when we're working with our run to position and even run using encoder, you always want to stop and reset your encoders, because sometimes they have junk values. Sometimes you may be running it or running multiple pieces of code. Sometimes you're going from autonomous to teleop, which is a very common thing to do in FTC. You want to make sure that you're starting from 0 rather than whatever number. So always be sure to set this mode first, stop and reset encoder. Right here, we're creating two variables for left position and right position. I shouldn't have to tell you why you use variables, but rather than having to set magic numbers like 2000, where if someone was looking at your code and said, I don't know what 2000 is, make it make sense. I'm just setting the left and right. I'm just setting it to a variable called left position and right position, making that 2000. In my case, this is for a driving chassis. But if you're using an arm, you probably only need one variable. You shouldn't be copying this code. You should be learning from it, not copying it directly. And I swear to you, if I see this exact code and your application is literally not a robot with two motors, a demo bot, I should say, with two motors, I will be very upset. Here, I am setting left position and right position. I'm setting both left and right position because, again, our applications are different. Where in most of your cases, you'll be using this for moving your arm. In my situation, I'm using this to move my left and right wheels 2,000 ticks. the crux of this is to have something that's reusable, so I'm not always dropping in 2,000 blocks. And if someone was to look over my code, they would see that it's left position and right position, not random numbers. So this next block sets target position. I'm setting the left motor and the right motor to the left position and the right position, and then I call run to position. Set target position can be positive or negative, but it is a position that your motors will try to get to. Set mode run to position just tells our motors your job now is to try to get to that target position. This will not move your robot, however, because we're missing one extra call, which we'll show later. And by later, I mean right now. So while op mode is active, I have two buttons for this example. I have X and I have circle. So when X is pressed, we set our target positions again, and there's a reason for this, which I'll get into afterwards. But we set our target position, we set the motor modes to run to position, and then we set the power to 0.8, which is different from what we have up there. What this does is it'll have our motors will move with 80% power to those positions that we specified. And it does that by essentially counting the amount of ticks until it gets to that position. The joy of this is once it's at that position, it tries its best to stay at that position. This doesn't mean that it'll correct itself if it's not at that position. There's a whole lot more depth to it, which I think is explained in the game manual 0 entry. But for all intents and purposes, once it gets to that position, it won't do anything else. It just stays there. With the circle button, we do the same thing, actually. We set our target position to 0. We then set the run mode to run to position, and then we try to move to that target position of 0 with 80% power. Now, because the target position is less than our left-right position, it's essentially going to move backwards. So it'll subtract from the current tick count that the motors see, or that the motors are currently reading. If we really wanted to read out what the current positions are for our motors, which is what I'm doing in this telemetry call, you could call the left, or you could call the current position block, which should be under DC motor or somewhere there. Go fish. In this telemetry data, we could see that I showed the current position as well as the left position and right position, which should always just be 2000. And it's more for a visualization. If I press X, it'll move 2000. If I press circle, it'll move back to 0. And so the current position will either be 2000 or 0. I'm pretty sure it initializes to 0 because we have stop and reset encoder. So what would happen if, for example, I were to press X twice, or if I were to press cross twice? The first time, it'll try to move to that position. The second time, it won't do anything because it's currently already at that position. So it kind of sees the run to position. It then says, I'm already at that position. And then it does nothing. But if I were to press something like X circle, depending on how fast I pressed it and where we are in the teleop loop, it'll probably move forwards, then backwards, then forwards, and backwards. So you could easily see if we have multiple positions we need to run to, especially with something like a telescopic lift or a cascading lift, and we need to move to specific positions, we could essentially figure out multiple target positions using either brute force it, but I would definitely wouldn't recommend brute forcing it when we have math on our side. But we could figure out the target positions or the target heights that we're looking to move out to, and then set our target positions based on whichever button is being pressed. We could even go as far as to make it so that you press one button and it'll move up one. You could press it again, it'll move up to the second stage, and press it again the third time, and it moves up to that final stage, but no further than that. And if you press another button, we could have it move backwards. But I'm not going to code that right now. What I do want to leave you with is better practices to keep in mind when working with code. And if I've kind of talked to you about autonomous or how to work with autonomous, then you should have some idea about creating functions and task-based programming. Task-based programming is kind of it's a bit of an extension of using functions correctly, but we're essentially thinking about it in a way of, if you want to move forward, there should be a function to move forward. If you want to move backwards, there should be a function to move backwards. If you're trying to open your intake or close your intake, or if you're trying to grab an object, there should be a function to grab an object. And that function goes through the whole process of extending, dropping your intake, rolling your intake in, picking something up, waiting for that thing to be picked up, and then doing those sequences in reverse. There's a little bit of, it's a good way of reducing redundancy and just cutting down on duplicate code and making sure that everything's a little maintainable. So you should be able to see right off the bat, these two blocks of codes that we see here are pretty much the same. They're pretty redundant. We should have a way of easily passing or creating a function to essentially reduce this redundancy, to simplify our code. So I'm going to go about doing that real quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this function block right here. We'll call it move drive. I'm calling it move drive because, again, it's all about the application. And so what I want to do is I'm going to take all this right there, drop it here because that's the code that I'm looking for. I'm going to give myself an input because I want to be able to input two things. I want to be able to input the position as well as power. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And so with that, should have some variables. So target position will move to position. And power, rather than 0.8, rather than a magic number, we'll just use power. So that's my function right there, move drive. So we can now get rid of these blocks over here and instead use this function. So we have move drive and the position that I care for, since again, since we don't really need this left right position, we could probably just use left, better variable names, but that's an aside. I'm just going to copy left for now. I'm going to move that position and then power. In this case, I think magic number is A-OK. But if it's like, if it's a number that's kind of never going to change, then we call those constants. And so let's kind of create a variable for it. So let me create a variable. Let me call this move power. So I'm going to set move power up here, and I'm going to set that to 0.8. And then whenever I want to move with power, I'm going to use my move power block right there. Cool. So we have that move drive, and here I'm going to set this to be 0, but again, you should probably not be using magic numbers. You should be using meaningful variable names. So rather than 0, it would just make sense to use something like resting position, or default position, or anything that's not just a number. So with that, we should be able to see our robot moving forwards and moving backwards. All right. So I got my encoder set up. All good. And our controller's connected. We'll run this op mode. And we can see there we have our positions, our left and right positions to be 2000s. And I have the current position set at 0 because it's nice and reset. And we'll see that when I press that cross button, our robot moves out of frame, which is about 2,000 ticks. And if I were to press that circle button, it moves forward back to its current position. And if I were to continue to press that circle button, nothing happens because it's already at that position. And again, as I said before, when we kind of press the targets back and forth, it tries its best to move to whatever position. And we should be able to see right now that it's a little uncontrolled, but it's currently trying its best to hold that 0 position. And so even if I were to, let's say, try to push it out of the way, there's a bit of resistance with the position that it's trying to be in because the motors are still on, they're still active. So it's not going to fall. Unlike if I were to cut the power right here, the stop, it's able to roll very easily. Versus again, when it's active and we give it a position to hold to, in this case, I'm going to give it that circle position, which is 0. Yeah, it'll try to hold that position. And even if I were to do something like try to really push it out of the way, no, it's not going anywhere. It is staying at a position that it believes to be is 0. So I hope that shows you enough to get you going, but there's a few little points that I'd kind of like to discuss just a little. Let me ramble for just a little bit. Drivers will probably be taken aback by not having to press and hold down buttons. That's a driver skill issue. Tell them to get used to it. This is usually how we should be doing. There's no need for a driver to move through all that range of motion. There are some special cases, especially if, you know, something mechanically is broken. Another, on the topic of mechanical, encoders work best when the system isn't stressed. Meaning, if your motors, or if you're trying to use your motors to hold up an arm, and that arm is way too heavy for the motor, it's gonna fall. Encoders aren't going to really fix that problem. It's just stalling. It's overcome by mechanical. So always ensure that you are mechanically sound in your designs. There's still a whole lot more to working with encoders. For example, as I've mentioned previously, the take back half algorithm for flywheels is one such case. The biggest case that you'll be looking to implement are PID loops or PID control systems. PID control loops are fairly important to just all of robotics and make sure that your robots are moving with precision, but they require a whole lot of tuning, which I don't really have the time to teach at this point in time. I guess another thing to kind of look into is how you would go about implementing this on your drivetrain. And this is an interesting problem in the sense that we want to essentially be having our robots move to a position, but the position is always moving. So we can't always be moving to specific positions. We're trying to move forwards and backwards to target positions. But when our robot comes to a rest, it should still have that behavior that you've seen in the video of it's not going to move anywhere. And that's really, really good for something like not being pushed out of the way when doing some defensive or offensive things. But anyways, that should be it for this video. I hope it helps. And thanks for watching.